going on, YouTube? This is SG1 Sports, and you're watching our college football channel. It's time to look back at the ACC and which teams were maybe overrated and underrated based off of how they performed in one-possession games. You can learn a lot from this as you look back and see which teams could have had a much better season, could have had a much worse season, and it tells you a lot about, again, which teams maybe were overrated and underrated, and it can kind of give you an indication of what to expect next year. Maybe you don't need to overhype some of these teams, or maybe there's a team you need to watch out for because they were better than their record, but they just lost a lot of close games. And this plays out, if you look at this throughout the last few seasons, this can really tell you a lot about the next season. Not always, but a lot of times it does. So we're going to start with looking back at what this could have told us about from 2021. And you see Wake Forest, they were really good in one-possession games, 3-1. They had a drop-off. Really not much to learn here out of the Atlantic Division. Most teams were pretty close to 500. So again, not a lot of, nothing crazy going on in the Atlantic Division. Let's look at the records from this year. You see Clemson at the top, then Florida State, NC State, Syracuse, Louisville, Wake Forest, and Boston College. So how did they play in one-score games? Well, Clemson was 3-1. Clemson had a really good season as far as the close games go. Florida State was 3-2. NC State was 4-1. So it could have easily been a much different year there for NC State. And then Wake Forest at 1-3. Remember, they were, I think, the opposite of that. 3-1 last year. This year, 1-3. And it's funny how that kind of plays out that way a lot of times. And so I think they were better than their 7-5 record. Maybe Clemson and NC State were not as good as their record. And maybe that showed up when you saw Clemson lose to South Carolina. So what if all of these teams won all of their one-score games? That would have put Clemson at 11-1. But check out Florida State. If they win a couple of those close games, Florida State would have been 11-1, and one of those wins could have come against Clemson, and they could be in the college football playoff discussion, especially with that win over LSU. So how easily things could have gone differently for Florida State. Could have been right there in that playoff conversation if they could have won a couple more of those one-score games. Then you look at NC State. They could have been 9-3, could have been a little better. Syracuse could have been 8-4. Louisville could have been 9-3. That would have been a really good season for them. And there is Wake Forest, 10-2. They could have been 10-2, which was their record last year. Everything just kind of reversed. And that's just the way it plays out. Like I said, if a team's really good in one-score games one year, the next year, odds are they probably won't be as good. And that's just how it seems to go most of the time. Boston College could have been 5-7. So even if they won their close games, they still would not have made it to a bowl game. So how about the opposite side of this? What if all of these teams had lost their one-possession games? Clemson could have been 7-5. Could have been a much, much different season for them. Florida State could have been 6-6. So it could have been a different year for them as well. And you can see some pretty bad seasons that could have happened for these teams. NC State could have been 4-8. I mean, they were that close to being 4-8. Syracuse could have been 5-7. Louisville and Wake Forest, even with the worst case scenario, these teams still would have made it to a bowl game. And then Boston College, boy, they could have been 1-11. Could have been just a disastrous season. And it was a bad year. 3-9. I didn't see that one coming. I thought BC was going to be much better. I thought they'd be a 6-6, 7-5 team. And obviously they were not. So if these teams split their one-score games, you see Clemson would have been 9-3. Florida State would have been 9-3. And technically, Florida State would have been 8.5 and 3.5. But we're rounding these off this year to whatever's closer to the actual record for the team. NC State would have dropped one to 7-5. Syracuse still would have been 7-5. Louisville still would have been 7-5. Wake Forest would have been better. They would have been 8-4. So you see, Wake Forest would have moved all the way up to third. And maybe you could say they really were the third best team in this division. And Boston College still would have been 3-9. So they still would have had the same record. So let's go to the Coastal Division now. What could we learn from 2021? So look at Miami, 5-3. They were really good in one-score games. That means maybe that they should drop off, and they did drop off. Virginia also dropped off. Georgia Tech was 1-4. They turned things around, had a much better season. So like I said, teams that struggled in the one-score games one year, the next year they're probably going to have a better record. It's just how it plays out. So let's look now to 2022. There's North Carolina at the top. Pitt and Duke were very quietly 8-4. Nobody really talking about those teams, but they had pretty good seasons. And Georgia Tech had a decent season as well. I know they didn't make it to a bowl game, but the way things started for them, fire their coach and still get to 5-7, pretty good year. Miami at 5-7, and then Virginia Tech, they didn't get to finish their seasons because of the tragedy, of course, which you see 3-7 and 3-8. And we're gonna play this out as if Virginia split those last two games. And I think I did like a half game for Virginia Tech as well when we put in the numbers here. But you look at the one-score games. There's North Carolina at the top, 6-2. They were really good in the one-score games. So you could say maybe this team was overrated, and maybe that showed up in the game against Clemson because they got blown out. And it also tells us that North Carolina is a team that's going to be probably a hot pick, a trendy pick for next year to have a really good year. But were they really as good as we thought this year? And maybe next year they'll go into the season overrated a little bit. We'll see how that goes. But, that doesn't tell the whole story. Drake May, of course, will be back, and he's going to be one of the best quarterbacks in the country. Pitt was 2-2. Duke was 3-4. Georgia Tech was 4-1. They were really good. And remember, they were bad in the one-score games in 2021. Miami was 2-2. Virginia 2-3. Virginia Tech was 1-4. Could have been a much different year for them if they could just win some close games. And if all these teams did win their one-score games, you'd see North Carolina at 11-1. Pitt could have been 10-2. But here's the big one. Look at Duke. 12-0. Duke was just a few plays away from being 12-0 in the regular season. This was a really good football team, and I think they're really being underrated. I know they didn't play the most difficult schedule, but still, all of their losses by one score, they probably weren't even considered for the top 25 rankings, but they probably should have been. Again, 8-4, a really good year for them, but they had the best case scenario. They had the highest ceiling this year, where, again, they could have gone 12-0 if they win those one-score games. Georgia Tech could have been 6-6, could have made it to a bowl game. Miami could have been 7-5, still nowhere near a playoff caliber team. It could have had a better season. Virginia and Virginia Tech would have been 8-4 if they would have won their one-score games and then finished the year off with wins as well. So how about if these teams lost all of their one-score games? Look at North Carolina. They could have been 3-9. Wow, what a difference that would have been. So from 11-1 to 3-9, they finish towards the top of that at 9-3. Pitt could have been 6-6. Duke could have been 5-7. So we talk about 12-0 possibility. Also 5-7 was a possibility. Georgia Tech could have been 1-11. They were very fortunate to win some close games. Miami could have been 3-9. Virginia could have been 1-11. Virginia Tech also could have had a really bad year at 2-10. Again, that's assuming those teams finished off their seasons. And again, I think what we did was we went with the best case scenario. Virginia would have won the final two games. Worst case, they would have lost the final two games. So if these teams split their one-score games, you see North Carolina would not have finished at the top of this division. Instead, it would have been Pitt and Duke at the top. And if you really break it down, because Duke would actually be 7.5, Pittsburgh was the best team in this division. So it would have been Pitt, then Duke, then North Carolina, then Miami, then Georgia Tech and Virginia. Actually, Virginia Tech would have been up there with Miami, and then Georgia Tech and Virginia. So I think we can learn a lot from this. Maybe not as much as don't want to take too much away from it, but definitely tells us a lot about how the season could have been much different for these teams, and maybe which teams were a little bit overrated or underrated, or at least better or worse than what their record would suggest. Your thoughts on all this? Let me know down in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more here on the SG1 Sports College Football Channel.